So I just grabbed two maps here on the Australia and its climate. So we've got seasonal rainfall. You see that big band of white across the middle there that extends into the Pilbara. That's pretty dry country, so we don't see a lot of carnivorous plants there. So we're concentrating our diversity on the northern part of Western Australia and the southwest. If we look at the temperature range, that's monsoonal country. It's tropical, it's warm, but it has that distinct rainy period in the warmer of the summer months, I should say, or what they call the wet season, and then followed by a dry period. And the season starts off with these storms, lightning, lots of lightning, and that often burns away the low scrub and creates perfect habitat for carnivorous plants. But it's quite varied, and to get around, you've often got to travel by light aircraft. The last trip I did up there was in March, and to get into the heart of the Kimberley, all the roads are closed right through that wet season. So the only way in was via light aircraft, and this is the mail plane. So it does a run from all the stations, and we hitched a ride on that and got dumped into the heart of the Kimberley, where we spent 2 weeks. This is a view from the plane, so you can see there really rocky country. There's these sandstone platforms that travel for hundreds of kilometres, and little pockets in between that create these microclimates for carnivorous plants. And then there's wide areas of savanna or monsoonal savanna that's often waterlogged for many weeks at a time. Of course, once you're in the country, travelling around on these four-wheel motorbikes is a bit of fun, and it's also the best way to get around. We're able to cover sort of 70 kilometres a day in these things, and then when we got out to the country where the plants were, it's then on foot from there. Very hot work, but you know, what an incredible place. One of the things in the top end that's really a good indicator of carnivorous plants is termite mounds. When you see termite mounds that are black or dark grey, that's fantastic soil for carnivorous plants. Boggy soil for many months at a time, and they like that habitat. In the Kimberley, these little white ones are really good indicators for carnivorous plants, and a lot of the utricularia around these wet areas. When you see the big red and orange ones that you'll often see in tourist brochures, they're an indication that you're probably not going to find carnivorous plants. You see there in front of those termite mounds lots of Drosera ordensis, one of the Petiolaris complex species. Beautiful things, certainly at this stage of the season when it's sort of tailing off at the end. They've mostly finished flowering, and they just look spectacular. The hairs on them just make them really beautiful, in my opinion. Very challenging to grow. You'd expect that these things would be quite easy to grow, but they are challenging to grow. You need very warm conditions. Although this past season I've been able to grow them through and send them through a proper top-end dormancy, baked hard and dry, and they've come through the following season, so may yet be able to crack the code on them. Drosera derbiensis, as the name suggests, grows only around Derby in the western Kimberley, and Drosera brumensis, which is the furthest southwestern of the Petiolaris Drosera, and believe it or not, it grows around Broome. In the same country, these fields of wet, sodden monsoonal forest, we also get Biblis. This is Biblis rarida, Fantastic species, and the one form that I found here around Derby gets these beautiful fimbriate margins to the petals, probably the most spectacular I've seen. Then you get into country that's a bit wetter. These rivers, actually the next slide, this river here that we crossed, they hadn't seen a crocodile here since November, so November to March. We found out later that no one had been there since November, but we made 2 trips back and forth, and we all got across and back. Okay, so the crocs were obviously further downstream, enjoying the bounty of the monsoonal season. In these sort of habitats, you do find things like Drosera Burmannii around the margins. Aldrovanda grows in some of these waterways, certainly where it's not free-flowing for months at a time. This sort of area, the backwaters of these tributaries, are great habitat for aquatic Utricularia and species like Aldrovanda. And then we get up onto the sandstone country, and that's Adam Cross there in shot. He works out at the University of Western Australia, and he is studying the seed storage in these ephemeral pools that occur in the sandstone. Now the rock there that he's standing on gets to over 70 degrees Celsius during the day. It literally melts the soles off your shoes. The first day that we were up on this country, because I come from such a cold climate, I really struggled. I drank 8 litres of water and still ended up dehydrated and laid up by the end of lunchtime. Incredible country, but carnivorous plants thrive in this. It's just phenomenal. And yet, when it dries out in, say, April, May, these shallow pools end up with a very thin film of soil, which is filled with seed, a lot of carnivorous plant seed, and that's baked for 6-7 months of the year, 70 degrees plus, and that seed stays viable. And yet when we bring it home into our own collections, we struggle to germinate it. Up on the sandstone country, you get these little tributaries, fantastic areas for carnivorous plants. So you get seepage zones leading into these little creeks. So you get carnivorous plants in the creeks themselves, and you'll also get them up in the margins around wherever you see these pandanus plants. And I forgot to take this slide out. Guessing competition, who knows the name of this one?
Utricularia.
Fantastic. Well, I'll think of the name shortly. As I said, Drosera Burmannii, very common around the edges of these waterways. Very easy to grow in cultivation, and very common right across the top end of Australia. Extends all the way down here to Sydney on the east coast, and of course right into Asia. Biblis, this is mostly Biblis filifolia. You can see there the seep, this small depression on that sandstone pavement with the plants there growing in the shallow soil, but they'll also grow in these puddles. So the seed's there in this really shallow soil. In fact, that plant's growing in a gram of matter, and that's it. So it's germinated in the water, some matter's accumulated around it, and that's what's kept it anchored in the puddle. And you'll see fields of these Biblis and the associated Drosera that are twice the size of this room. Fantastic. Drosera subtilis, another annual species specialised in these sandstone pavements and this saturated habitat. This field here, all those scapes there are Drosera paradoxa. So, as I said, huge areas of these plants. It's really quite spectacular. And then we see some of the variation there in Drosera paradoxa. And I think someone was after a new species So we've got one just here, which is a close relative of Drosera paradoxa, but this is one that prefers the free draining, drier sandstone country. Floral morphology is quite different, the way the scape is presented and the sepals differ as well. This one's yet to be described.
It looks like a cross between one of the Northern Territory ones and a pygmy Drosera.
It certainly does, yeah. I think when you see species like this and you compare them to some of the pygmies like Drosera barbigera or Gibsonii or Scorpioides, very, very similar. And I wouldn't be surprised if they came from a common ancestor.
That's been demonstrated with genetic work.
Yeah, geez, I should have read that up first. And then, of course, you get this fantastic group, the Drosera indica complex, which was only split apart, well, it was split apart many years ago, over 100 years ago, and then lumped back together and has been split apart again, predominantly worked by Alan Lowry. And these things are fantastic species. This is Drosera cuculata with its fantastic cobra head-like stamens, but the glands that are produced by these plants on their stem and on their pedioles is what distinguishes a lot of these species. And as you'll see with this one, it's got a distinct petiole, small yellow glands and a few white ones on the stem, but very bare otherwise. Then you've got others like, think of a name for them, Barretiorum, which has these, as Alan described them, potato crisp-like trichomes on the petioles, but the glands run all the way back to the stem, so there's no distinct petiole on those plants. And as you can see, the floral morphology is different. So now we're going to jump down to the southwest. Fairly flat state, but they do have a few peaks. This is the Stirling Ranges, and its highest peak a little over 1,000 metres, and this is one of the areas that is of greatest interest to me, coming from a cool climate botanic garden. The Stirling Ranges has those high peaks, and there are plants there that we can and will grow at the Blue Mountains Botanic Garden. On some of these peaks, and in fact even in some of the lower areas, they have these granite features that dominate the landscape, and it's these features that accumulate moisture throughout the cooler months and is what sustains the plants. So the moisture comes down as through the sediments that are in those rocks and in the cracks, and that slowly comes out over the months and keeps that soil just at the right level of moisture for carnivorous plants to grow and thrive. Back on top of the mountains here, we've got the very recently described, on the left there, Drosera Gigantea variety Philmaniana, described by Dr. Robert Gibson just here in the room. This spectacular little taxon has been known to many of us for 30, 40 years. It's been known for a long time, but it's only recently that it's been had the sharp tools put over it and been pulled out. But it's a great little plant that occurs only in those high peaks. And on the right hand side there, Drosera monticola, which is also endemic to the Stirling Ranges and the higher peaks. It actually occurs on, I think we're up to about 7 peaks with that species, and likewise with the Gigantea. As I said, these granite features are right across the southwest. So this is a fairly low level one in the Perth Hills. We're probably talking only 300 metres above sea level. And we get this rainfall from autumn through to early spring that's generally fairly light but consistent, and that feeds into these features, and the water is funneled down into the shallow soil. In places, this soil will only be 10 centimetres thick or less, but that's the perfect habitat to keep the temperature right for the tubers over the summertime, and the moisture right for these plants to thrive over the cooler months. And of course, if the soil was any deeper, that would allow the trees and the shrubs that you see in the background there to come into this soil and outcompete the carnivorous plants. And here you can see side on the thickness of that soil level there, and it's got quite a high peat content, but otherwise just decomposed granite. And you've got Drosera stricticornis there, reaching its flowering time when just about middle of shot there, Drosera Gigantea hasn't even grown its first leaves. So this is September and Drosera Gigantea hasn't grown its first leaves. A lot of people think that Gigantea is a winter growing species, and in a lot of areas it is, but there are also Giganteas that start mid to late winter and grow right through into summer. Of course, these granite acorns are great for the utricularia. This is multifida. Just about any granite outcrop from Perth around to Albany will be covered in these in the springtime, and it's quite a sight. And there we see it down at ground level. Now, also on the rock outcrops and also in some of the woodland areas where the shallow's a little soil, you get species like Drosera stolonifera. Beautiful in the afternoon sun, and one author described these as the glistening carnivores. If you haven't seen that book, check it out. You can pay me later, Stu. Drosera purpurescens. You don't often see photos of these things from above, so I thought that was a nice angle. You can see there the moss has died back through the summer. The plants have come through early season. Jeez, I should have told everyone to turn their phones off. So the plants have come back. The moss hasn't yet come back, so these plants will grow for a couple of extra months. The moss will come on, and then of course it dries out again through the summertime. Some of the other tuberous species, and this is one of the most spectacular, Drosera Glandular, grows in the slightly deeper soils of the woodland areas, so not out on those granite aprons, but in the wooded areas, and the tubers are quite deep, quite large, and so are these plants. We're talking 20 centimetres in diameter. Spectacular in the wild, and this is only 20 minutes drive from Perth itself. In cultivation, these things are really quite easy. Large pot, free draining media and open bench is how I grow them, and they absolutely thrive in those conditions, overhead watered, only through the cooler months. Drosera erythrorhiza, closely related to the previous taxon. Drosera Glandular, this is, I think, one of the most spectacular of all of the Australian Drosera. It's an annual, it's tiny, but it has the fastest moving leaves of any sundew. It has, which you can see unfurling there on the right hand side, these elongated tentacles on the margins, which don't have sticky mucilage like the other glands on the plant, but they have sensitive pads. You can see there in the lower part of the photo those tiny little sensitive pads on the end, and if an insect crawls across those, they flick the insect across into the centre of the plant. You can see a few there in the middle that have bent right over, possibly flicking that pebble into the centre of the plant. But they'll move faster than the blink of an eye, so incredibly fast. And you can see a young juvenile sundew bug waiting for its meal to arrive. Drosera perector, another plant from the wooded areas. So we're talking almost closed canopy, eucalypt or banksia scrub, deep sandy soils, and these plants thrive in that habitat, which is really not what you'd expect carnivorous plants to grow in. But they thrive in those conditions, but they require fires, occasional fires, to keep that scrubland open enough for the plants to thrive. You'll see this one growing in places like Kings Park and Botanic Gardens, so out in the natural areas off there you'll see them in the winter period.